Hello, everyone. Welcome to PwC Tax Bite podcast series. My name is still Peter, but I'm very pleased that I could manage to get Giovanni Jesus in my virtual recording studio. Giovanni, I don't think you need an introduction. You are well known. You are an expert in the field of trade, tariffs, and many other items. At the time of recording of this podcast, and we're around the first week of March, you are also quite famous. You appear on television. You appear in interviews. So that must mean, Giovanni, something is happening in the trade world. And of course, we don't need to look far. There is the recent U.S. Supreme Court case on U.S. tariffs, and that's exactly what I wanted to amongst others, talk with you about today. Maybe for the audience, maybe good to give a bit of more context. The U.S. Supreme Court took its decision. Can you recap a bit? What was the case about? What did the court decide, and what is the impact, Giovanni?
Yes, thank you, Peter, for that introduction. So yes, indeed, our friends across the ocean have stirred again the global trade pot, and yeah, we see quite some changes there. So yeah, what happened now a few weeks ago? So basically, as soon as President Trump took office, and yeah, actually already in the running for president, he made it very clear that he wanted to put America first, and that he sees tariffs as an instrument of enforcing their agenda, but also bringing production back to the US, and being less dependent. They have a large trade deficit. They are a net importer of goods from around the world, and he wanted to change that. And he sees tariffs as an instrument. And actually, very quickly, he started with some measures against Canada, Mexico, and China, which was in view of the fentanyl crisis, so the drug crisis that they have, and said, well, because of that fentanyl crossing the borders, I will put a tariff on you. And actually, that was a starting point. And in a nutshell, the president has a number of instruments based on a number of acts. They have the Trade Act of 1974 and the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, in which they have a number of sections, which are, you could call them specific instruments that allow the president to put in force certain tariffs. Now, all these sections, they come with certain conditions. There needs to be a research that is performed. There needs to be a certain outcome. There are certain limitations. So they're very solid instruments. They have been tested and approved, but they come with some conditions. Now, what President Trump has been using to a large extent is the International Emergency Economic Powers Act of 1977. So basically, you declare an emergency, and that emergency allows you to regulate trade. And that's a bit the difference between the instruments I just mentioned before. These instruments, they specifically refer to tariffs, where that IEEPA, as they call it, only refers to the president has the power to regulate trade. And in the past, it has been used in view of, for instance, issues with Iran, with Venezuela, and so on, more from when there were large tensions on a certain country, that they can do certain things. Now, the thing is that doesn't come with any limitations. So it's a broad legislation. And that's what President Trump has been using for that fentanyl, but later on Liberation Day that we had, where these reciprocal tariffs were announced for all countries around the world. And actually, that was a starting point of the negotiations that took place in summer and so on. But also, the stick that they have been using when someone was not complying with their agenda. Think of Greenland, where there was a threat on tariffs. India recently, because they were buying Russian oil, and so on. So it was a very flexible instrument that they have been using, where court said, well, actually, no, you're imposing a tax, and a tax needs to pass Congress. And it doesn't refer to tariffs, that act. It only refers to regulating trade. So actually, you have been giving a too broad interpretation to that word, and that's deemed illegal. And that's what the court basically ruled, bringing us back a bit to the drawing board.
Okay, thanks, Giovanni. So back to the drawing board. So understand the tariffs under that specific section have been found unlawful. Back to the drawing board doesn't mean yeah, today no more tariffs, and what about tomorrow? What other options does the president have in this respect, Giovanni?
Yeah, yeah. So I think very important is that these tariffs that have been imposed under these other sections, for instance, section 232, which is industry specific. Um, they have done that for cars and automotive, for semiconductors, iron and steel and aluminum. So they remain in place. They are solid, but they were part of these investigations that took place, and those were actually, yeah, they remain as they are. Um, on the reciprocal tariffs, yeah, their IEEPA has been cancelled basically. They immediately reacted by one of these other sections that they could use, section 122, where the president has the power to input a tariff of up to 15%, so there's a limitation, for 150 days in case of basically a substantial balance of payments shortfalls. So basically, when it is a number of elements, and that's one of the critiques currently on the system, that a trade deficit is one of them, but it has also, in principle, to do with the influx of money, investments, the dollar position, and so on. But actually, they use that instrument to already put 10% in place. President Trump announced 15% on Truth Social, but to date, that hasn't been put into an executive order. So currently, there's 10% upon the standard tariff that is in place for most products, unless they are covered by one of these other sections already, as those also remain in place, as said.
Okay, 10%, the others remain in place. Now, some tariffs have been paid, of course, in the past under that section that has now been found unlawful. How about refund? I hear stories that potentially refunds are possible. Can you give an update on that one, Giovanni?
Yeah, well, the Supreme Court has taken the easy way out on that one. So they said if and how tariffs need to be repaid, we leave it up to lower courts. But of course, the basic element remains that they said the tariffs are illegal. So if you pay them, there should be a refund mechanism. And there has been a bit of back and forth on how that would need to happen. Um, the challenge is it's a very big amount. The estimates are between 130 up to 175 billion that has been paid. So it's a very, very large amount, ranging from just private individuals who have been importing something, one item they bought, up to large multinationals who might have hundreds of millions at stake. And there you see that, well, some companies already went to court. The Court of International Trade already ordered CBP to basically correct the declarations and remove the IEEPA tariff that was there, that they should do it automatically. They have replied that it's not possible, and they're working on another system where some say they're making it administratively hard to do that, to challenge the companies. But in essence, if you make an import declaration in the US, CBP, so US Customs has 314 days to close that import declaration, which means that actually, if you look at April to now, a large portion of these declarations will still be open. So you could basically do an adjustment there. And that's what some companies have done. Apparently, they have rejected that when companies have done that. But that's where the court ordered CBPs should do it automatically. Once they are closed, the court basically said if they're closed for less than 90 days, they should re-liquidate them and then do the change. If they are closed for more than 180 days, then in principle, you should go to court. But that's all being worked out currently on how it should work, where it's clear that the administration, due to the big financial impact, is not too happy to do the refund. But they get orders from the courts to work on something. So I think it's a matter of time until it becomes clear how it needs to be done. And the message we bring to companies is make the assessment at least, make sure you have the data, make sure you know what you're talking about. Are we talking about 10,000 euros or several million of euros? That you know the status of your declarations, who has made them, and so on. So when the time comes, and there is some clarity on the exact procedure, that you can also act very quickly. And because if you don't have the data ready, you will be at the end of the line. And it might take some time to get the money back. So.
Yeah, a clear message, I would say. Indeed, be ready, know your position. Is it a lot of money? What's the business case for doing the effort of getting some of the tariffs back. Very clear message, Giovanni. Now, maybe also for the audience, a small side note, I would say, reflection that I would have then with my background, Giovanni, if I hear you talk about refunds of tariffs. Yeah, there is a close connection also between tariffs and the value you apply within a group from a transfer pricing perspective when you are selling goods within the group. So any refund of tariffs, I think, should also be considered from a transfer pricing perspective. Who is then in the value chain entitled to that refund? Not legally, but I mean economically. Who should bear which part of the tariffs and who should get a refund? And I think also from an accounting perspective, there are various angles here to be looked at. But I think first step is indeed obtaining the refund, being ready for it, and collecting the data you need for that. So thanks for that. Now, Giovanni, the discussion on tariffs is much broader than that. And also on the European side, there were various messages on the trade deal that was negotiated between the European Union and the US. There are mentionings of hitting a pause button. Can you maybe recap for the audience what exactly this is all about?
Yeah. So when the tariffs were announced in April, you might recall that there was a 10% standard tariff applicable for all countries. And then they made a calculation, and if you recall, President Trump standing out there with a bit, pancart basically saying for this country it's 39%, for that country it's 20%, for this one is 15%, and so on. And basically, was a starting point, and that's where a number of discussions started, and a number of countries came to an agreement, like the UK, like the European Union, South Korea, and so on. Now, of course, the deal that Europe has covers more. It also covers these tariffs that are under other sections, where we negotiated a cap of 15%. So there could be an uplift, and just in case when the tariff already was higher than the 15%, it remained like that. Or if the standard tariff was lower than 15%, it would be topped basically up to 15 and no higher. So that gave us a fairly good position compared to others. Of course, it was a big increase. Typically 2% was the average, I think, for the imports in the US. Yeah, it brought it to 15%, but other countries had way higher tariffs. Now, immediately when the news came out, the European Commission has reached out to the White House to say, okay, what does this mean for our trade deal? Which is to a large extent a political deal. And on the US side, it is basically enforced by executive orders, where in Europe, of course, we have a legislative process that we need to follow, where we need to pass legislation via the parliament and so on. So there is a legislative process behind it, where there is a bit of reluctance due to the volatility, and the parliament was not too happy to vote for legislation when a lot of things are still unclear. And this, of course, did not help. Now, we did hear that the US reacted to say, okay, we want to honor the deal, and we want to keep the deal, but give us some time to work it out given the new environment. I think it has given Europe a bit more courage to push back on certain things. Here they will go for further exemptions and exceptions that are made for Europe. But there is much more on the table than just these, the 10% that they now put in place. A lot of sectors like iron and steel, for instance, the car sector, as US is a very important market for the premium brands, for instance. So there's much more on the table in that deal that they, of course, will not give away that easily. So I think there's more courage on the European side to make a better deal, but we will honor that deal. But it will take a bit of time to work it out and see what it exactly means in practice.
Yeah, quite a bit of uncertainty still, and uncertain elements. So we talked a lot about the US now, Giovanni. I think the audience is also very close, very interested in the broader developments in the tariff sector from a European perspective. We have the angle with India. We have other angles. Maybe can you also recap a little bit where Europe is standing in its discussions tariff-wise with other parts of the world?
Yeah. So what you have seen with the US also being very vocal on the America First principle, going a bit into a protectionist type of thinking. And to a certain extent, it makes sense. Certain sectors are heavily impacted, like we feel in Europe. So I can understand some of the reasons why they are doing it. But of course, they have done it in such a visible manner and such a disruptive manner that a lot of countries are thinking, aren't we too dependent of the US market? And Europe has always been a strong believer in free trade deals. And Europe actually took this momentum to push for trade deals. If you mentioned India, I think that was a discussion of more than 20 years that also was quite stuck. And now we have been able to close that deal. Mercosur was also not an easy one. Due to what President Trump has been doing, it basically gave that energy to make sure that those deals are closed. So at this point in time, they're to a large extent still the political agreements. They need to be ratified and put into legislation. So yeah, you will start to see the effects in a year from now, I would say. But it's very clear that that Europe wants to go on that route. Start the discussions with these countries and um, also has been very pragmatic about how they want to close these deals. So like for India, for instance, normally these trade deals come with a lot of requirements for the country that we basically give lower duties, where they now have chosen for a bit more pragmatic manner and opening the discussion rather than being very strict and having discussions that keep on going forever. So I think there's also an opportunity for companies to look into these deals, see what other markets might be open, and that could be visited going forward as a new potential and to diversify trade basically.
Yeah. Thanks for that overview, Giovanni. I think very interesting for everyone to get this condensed summary of where we are. We're moving towards the end of the podcast, and I will not take too much of your time because, yeah, these are extremely busy times for you with all these developments. Was one last question I had for you. In the past days, there was some mentioning of the Made in Europe plan. I just wanted to ask you there, for the audience listening into the podcast, is this something that the listeners should know about, should follow? What is this plan about? Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes. The Made in Europe initiative is actually the Industrial Accelerator Act, which was proposed on the 4th of March. And it's basically, some say it's a bit of a repacking of our green agenda. There has been quite some pushback on saying we put a lot of administrative burden on the companies and aren't we putting ourselves in a difficult position by putting a lot of pressure on the industry and actually pushing the industry out of the EU. And actually, this act, amongst others, due to the pressure we get from the US, is actually trying to turn these things into a positive and actually an innovative advantage that we might have. So they look into a number of things. We know that, for instance, we have energy dependence on a lot of regions because we don't have that much oil resources and so on ourselves. Also on critical minerals, we are dependent on other regions. So the act is actually looking into how can we link the green agenda with innovation and resilience. That's basically what it is about. So there will be the Made in Europe principle that they put forward is basically saying that they would give priority to initiatives that are of a European nature that, for instance, make use of green energy and like battery materials, that looking into semiconductors, and also looking at how can we reduce the permitting, for instance, that is quite a heavy burden for a lot of companies. How can we go farther? Targeted financial support for low carbon production and so on. So it's really, not stepping completely away from the green agenda, but putting it more into an industrial act that actually can help our companies being more competitive and supporting that competitive nature and trying to marry the best of both worlds, basically, to bring that together, making sure we have our green ambitions still there, but at the same time still have an industry that can act and basically also potentially export later on the innovation that we have done in that sense. So it's an important change in mindset, I would say, on a European level. So I hope it opens a lot of doors, and that's also a way that our companies can benefit from what maybe before was too much regulation, and that we now have the focus more on innovation, really and yeah, make that we get out of this much stronger, I would say.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Giovanni. We are at the end of the podcast, and so I thank you for this very concise but clear overview of the different developments, Giovanni. It comes with a warning for the audience. If you listen to this podcast, by the time that you listen to it, things could have changed significantly. They change overnight. Sometimes we see so a little warning to double check. Yeah, Giovanni.
Yeah, so probably it changed indeed by the time you hear it. But yeah, like we said, looking into your data, knowing where you stand, knowing what your options are, that remains key.
Yeah, no, indeed. Thank you. But I thank you for the audience for tuning in. Stay tuned with the podcast series. We'll come back if further developments happen. Giovanni, thank you very much for being here in the podcast. And yeah, let's talk again when something changes. Thanks.
Thank you. Talk soon.